I'm starting recording, and just up front, we both agree that we can take this audio, post it, right? This is not a private discussion.
No. Yeah, no, I'm totally cool with that.
All right, you have headphones on, I guess?
No, I do not have headphones on. So I have
Okay.
just my desktop audio.
Okay, well, hopefully it works. Hopefully you don't get an echo. I'm watching it record. It looks a bit strange the way it's working, like they're recording at different speeds, but hopefully that's just an artifact of something.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll figure it out. Okay, so we're going to talk about effective altruism, right? And do you want to give a little bit about like why you're interested in that and your background in that?
Yeah. So I first found out about effective altruism when I was looking for a way out of my corporate biotech job. I was deeply unhappy and dissatisfied and felt like I got into research and got my PhD because I wanted to learn and share what I learned and have an effect on the world, do something useful. And I felt like, okay, I'm not doing that. So I found effective altruism through the 80,000 hours podcast. And it started me on this route of questioning everything. So even the thing I won't get into what I like about it, but basically what effective altruism is a philosophy. It's also a group of people that are into optimizing the good that they can do for the world. So the philanthropy and the altruistic things you can do in the world. So they're very into figuring out how to do the most good. Um, so they use a rational approach. It's kind of a utilitarian spin-off philosophy. And I thought, well, that can't be bad, or the likelihood of that being bad is probably low. And so as I got deeper into it, I came up with kind of this thought that, well, maybe I should really look into this philosophy if I'm going to actually. I mean, obviously, you want to kind of know what are the issues with it. And so I kind of wrote it off a little bit for a while as being utilitarian and not ideal. That itself is kind of a dystopia. But I decided to do a program after I read The Precipice by Toby Ord, which talks about existential risk and how we should be concerned with long-termism and the humans of the future. And so I read this book and I thought, okay, I need to think more about this. So I'm wrapping up a program with them. It's kind of their intensive, I don't know if it's called a fellowship, but basically we meet every week and we discuss concepts within effective altruism. And I'm highly critical of it. And so far, I don't feel like it's been buckling underneath my criticism. So I was I came across your YouTube video on moral progress. And I had some of the same concerns that you have in terms of free will and like whether we're actually participating in what we consider moral progress. So I thought it'd be fun to just kind of talk with you about it.
Okay, great. So that was a very good overview, I think, of your background. Well, actually, you didn't mention your academic background, but it's in neuroscience. Is that right? Or
Yeah.
neuroscience and philosophy?
No, no philosophy. Never took a philosophy course.
Okay, okay. Just neuroscience?
Yep, I'm a molecular neuroscientist. So,
Oh, okay. Well, that's
yeah.
interesting. I mean, I have a academic background in cognitive science and computing science, but not too much on the neuroscience.
Okay. They're kind of the same thing.
Well, there's certainly an overlap, an interesting overlap, but yeah, I don't know too much about the details of the brain, unfortunately. Okay, so I mean, you described effective altruism. I guess I could give my take on it or
Yeah.
my like high level definition of it. And I think what might be missing from your definition is the underlying assumptions of it.
Hmm.
So because you may take those for granted, but
Well, no, it's actually my biggest question is how do we know what good is? How do we know we're
okay,
actually the hubris of it is actually my biggest criticism.
okay. Well, fair enough. So I would say that effective altruism is a claim to be a rational approach to ethics. as opposed to an intuitive or emotional approach in which, you just feel something is good or bad, and you assume other people can sort of directly intuit what is good or bad. Effective altruism tries to define ethical action rationally, right, by reasoning about causes and effects and so on. But I don't think it is very rational about its underlying assumptions, or that it reflects on them. I would say the underlying assumptions are: one is altruism, which is the assumption that we should act to benefit others, that this is like a moral imperative that is built into something, it's just there. And then the other is hedonism, which is that feelings of pleasure and pain are positive and negative value, respectively. And I would say that these two assumptions are unquestioned, they're unexamined. And I would say especially hedonism is one of those things that I see people taking for granted but never questioning. This assumption that brain states, biochemistry in some part of the brain is value. Like, why should that be value? So I can give you a number of challenges to those two assumptions if you want. We could go through those, or you could, if you want to respond to what I just said.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I think you might be right about the hedonism part, because I actually had this discussion last night when we were talking about explicit expected value, and we were talking about the trolley argument, that if you force someone to pull the lever on someone, or whatever that value is of their life, you're not taking into consideration the emotional effects on that person and then the downstream effects of that. And so I think that I agree with you on that assumption, that I don't think they examine emotionality as well as they could or should or maybe will. But in terms of the moral imperative as to whether we should act or not, I don't know if you've really looked into kind of their thoughts about cluelessness and uncertainty and heavy-tailed impact, because I think their analysis of heavy-tailed impact might actually apply to the moral imperative. It's like, the Pascal's wager kind of thing, whether or not we should be acting upon this. So I think their thought is that hanging on long-termism, the potential value of doing good, or what we at least trying to define what that is or explore what that is, could be astronomical compared to the implications of doing nothing, which would then lead to existential risk. So I think the bigger assumption that they make is that we should continue consciousness, or humanity, whatever that is, or whatever that turns into. I think that's really what they're assuming. They're assuming that that's a good thing, but it's coming from a humanistic point of view. So I think that's where their biggest assumption is.
Right, but I mean, there is a simple question, which is, why should we act to benefit others? I mean, it's just taken for granted. I mean, you could say, I could give a reason why I want civilization to exist in the future that isn't altruistic, right? I mean, Pascal's wager is, a known fallacy, and I'm sure that their version of it is just as fallacious as the religious version. But, this is just an assumption that we are supposed to act to benefit others, that we have this moral imperative. And this is really just a religious belief, or an unexamined assumption. There is no a priori, prior to assumptions, reason why we must be altruistic. And I could give some very good reasons why that doesn't really make sense, or we can't really be altruistic anyway, even
Yeah,
if we
no,
wanted to.
that's a good argument, I think, to make, because I agree they hinge this entire philosophy on that we should. They've made that giant assumption at the start that we should, without being able to prove that definitively we should.
Right. Okay. So I'll give you some challenges to altruism, and then see if you agree or disagree or have thoughts about them. So first of all, I've already given the one that altruism is an unexamined and unquestioned assumption, and thus it isn't rational, right? Rationality means bringing things into consciousness where they can be examined and questioned, and then consciously asserting them or rejecting them. And this is to most people, including most people in the West anyway, including the effective altruism crowd. This is an unexamined, unquestioned assumption. It's something they simply take for granted. So, in absence of some justification, it's not that, that assumption is not rational. It's a framing assumption. Okay, so that's the first challenge, and I don't expect you to provide a justification of altruism right now, but if you have any
Yeah.
ideas about that, go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering what you mean by altruism is unexamined, because from an evolutionary perspective, biologists have been looking at altruism very closely in terms of what is the social glue that has led us to this point in evolution. And they find that altruism is a core component of that.
No, well, I mean, this is a very common misconception, and it is in some, there are some biologists, yes, who fallaciously assert that we evolved to be altruistic, but this involves conflating altruism with reproductive selfishness, almost in every case. Cooperation is not altruistic; it is selfish.
That's a big argument, right? This is actually a big argument within evolutionary biology.
Well, yeah, I'm taking a side on it. I actually have an essay, a couple of essays that go into detail on this, but yeah, there is a theory called kin selection theory, which claims that genes will be selected to benefit the gene rather than the individual who has the gene or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Without
Mm-hmm.
getting into all the details, kin selection theory is fallacious and can be debunked. So that's one point I would make, but it's another can of worms. But there is a concept in evolutionary biology called reciprocal altruism, which is a misnomer or an oxymoron, right? Because altruism is acting to benefit others. Now, if it's reciprocal, then you benefit from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there has been a lot of effort this is the moralistic fallacy. There has been a lot of effort to project human moral assumptions onto nature and see morality in nature where it does not really exist. So I see this all the time, and so this idea that, well, we know that we've evolved to be altruistic, it's not true. This is really
Well,
a delusion.
I think there's still more to learn about this, though, because I agree. Like, I think E.O. Wilson even came out saying that kin selection he's found to be not what he thought it was, but it's our understanding is always evolving. And so I think the problem is that we're trying to assert that it has no value. You're trying to prove that it's not true. And I don't think that is really rational or scientifically appropriate. I think until you can definitively rule out altruism as being part of the evolutionary process.
No, I'm saying we can definitively rule it out, yes.
No,
I
I
mean,
don't think we can. I don't think we
right,
can.
well, I think we can, and I can make the argument to that effect. But, the point is, in science, you don't say we don't know forever, right? At some point, you say, yeah, I know this, and that doesn't mean there can't be disagreements about it. But I'm very confident in saying, yes, I know that altruism does not evolve. And I can debunk kin selection theory, no problem. And I can give the
Well,
rationale for it.
yeah, I think a lot of people have gone down this road as well, but it doesn't mean the case is completely closed on the idea of altruism. It just means that in kin selection theory, in this particular way of thinking, in terms of inclusive fitness, it's out.
Well, I don't think it's out for most people yet, but yes, I would say it's out in that it can be debunked. But the argument against altruism evolving is very simple. It is that altruism is not evolutionarily stable, right? And that is the core concept in evolutionary theory that has explanatory power. It is the concept of evolutionary stability.
Yeah, but what is evolutionarily stable when you think about it in a long-term projection?
Well, it's stable under selection. It doesn't mean it's stable under mutation, because mutation creates the instability that allows for evolution, but it is stable under selection. So that's the concept of evolutionary stability. And the point is that altruism is not stable under selection, whereas selfishness is, and therefore altruism will always be defeated by selfishness. And when you look at instances of purported altruism in nature, you can always find a selfish explanation for them, which often, well, always makes more sense.
Sure, but you're looking at it from a zero-sum game. You're looking at it as a binary, whereas I would argue that it's additive, that it can exist alongside with selfishness. It's not an either or.
Well, then I think we might be working with slightly different definitions of altruism and selfishness, because I would say that they are opposites, that altruism means acting to benefit others at some expense to oneself, or at least at no benefit to oneself, whereas selfishness is acting to benefit oneself. Now, it gets quite complicated because you can define benefit in different ways, right? I actually have a long essay on this where I go through the different ways you could define it. Like one is reproductive fitness, another is energetic, right?
Mhm.
So there are types of altruism, that exist, like parental altruism toward children, because that's energetic altruism, but that is reproductively beneficial to the parents, right? So certain things can be selected for. But I mean, we may set this aside for a different discussion, because this will be very. I mean, I'm prepared to go the distance on this one, but
I'm
it
not. I'm
might take
totally
up.
not.
Okay, but this is something I think about a lot, but this might take a long time. So I guess we could say that we can set this question aside. But I mean, even if you were to say, well, maybe there's some altruism in nature or whatever, the type of altruism that, say, AA might propose, or the sort of hedonic utilitarians might propose, like trying to benefit all sentient life in some way.
Mhm.
This certainly has not evolved, and probably, I mean, I think we could argue this is not evolutionarily stable. But I mean, of course, it depends on what it would even
Mm.
translate into in terms of action, right? But
That's an interesting point, that it's not evolutionary stable, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't serve some utility, because I think the thing, and it's not uncommon for most people to be worried about existential risk. Maybe they don't call it that, but they're worried about the state of the world. And so this is something that's on people's minds constantly. And I think at the point in evolution where we are, we have never seen the possibility that we see now with the dangers of the man-made creations that we have. I think we've almost passed evolution. And so we're talking about where it doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean that we can't have artificially created it, and that it doesn't have some level of importance in where we need to go.
we certainly are in a radically new phase of evolution and of human history. However, we'll never transcend evolution in the broad sense of the term, because it's very simple and it's intrinsic to life, which is that, basically to exist, you need energy and
Mhm.
matter, but energy is the most important resource, and energy is limited. And, if you do things that give away free energy and something else doesn't do that, and it uses the energy to reproduce, then it will replace you. I mean, like, you could even say, well, okay, so there are the effective altruists out there. How many children are they having? And compare that to how many children
Right.
some, fundamentalist Jew or Muslim or whatever, or me is having. And then you could say, well, those other guys are going to win because they're not putting energy into this project of helping people somewhere else.
Do you have a lot of children?
Well, probably about 10 altogether.
Stop. No, you don't. Do you
No, I
really?
do. I do. Well, I don't know. Like, I was a sperm donor, right? But
Oh
I
my
also have,
God.
but I have five too as well, like
Oh
with
my
my
God.
wife. So
Wow. Like, did you donate to the Genius Institute?
no, no, I'm sure they wouldn't have accepted me. But well, I don't know. No, I just
That's
donated
weird.
to the local sperm bank. But the point is that regardless of, it's not about me personally, right? Like Bill Gates, he has a few kids or whatever, but some guy in Africa living in a mud hut, or some stereotype or whatever, maybe
Sure.
living in the suburb of Lagos, has more kids,
Right.
and there will be fewer. There'll be more people like him than there will be people like Bill Gates or whatever Jeff Bezos in the future.
It's true, but this could fall on a fat-tailed curve where those people have far less influence on the world and what happens than people potentially in like an effective altruistic community. Although I doubt it, considering effective altruists believe you should give away all your money.
Yeah, I mean, if you really, the point is a certain amount of altruism, especially if you are very rich, is not really going to have much of an effect on reproductive success. The big thing that matters now is, do you choose to reproduce? So this is kind of a tangent, really. But the point that I'm making is more of a long-term thing, right? So you're talking
Mhm.
about long-term risks. Well, I'm talking about long-term evolution. That exponential growth will defeat anything in the long run. If you're subsidizing the exponential growth of the human population that doesn't agree with you, that's going to beat you in the long run. There's no way you're going to change the world by subsidizing reproduction of people who don't agree with you, or even just in general of subsidizing other people's reproduction.
Right. Yeah. No, I can agree with that. I have my own criticisms of the philosophy in general. I mean, one of the things that I was talking about last week was the aesthetic of effective altruism. Virtually there is none. And so in a world where attention is currency, they ain't getting none. Like they got no currency because people are not drawn to a utilitarian aesthetic or philosophy. And so I'm actually surprised it's kind of lasted this long.
Yeah, well, people are drawn to us versus them, good versus evil.
Right.
We're good, they're bad, let's fight. I mean, that's the tragedy. I mean, we are heading toward a tragedy. Um, but that's a whole other issue. Okay, well, let me go through. We got off onto some pretty deep tangents, but let me just go through some of the challenges to altruism that I had written down here. So one is that life is intrinsically competitive. This is kind of related to what we were discussing, but it's a little more scoped. It's a little more narrow, which means that when you help one organism, you're almost always harming another. So
Mhm.
biologically, like you help a bird with a broken wing, well, the bird is going to eat insects and maybe it's going to eat other birds and it's going to grow up and it's going to compete with other birds and it's going to eat their food and it's going to fight over mates and so on. So, you can help individuals, but can you help in general? Can you be altruistic in general? Is
Right.
somewhat dubious because of the nature of life, right? There's a
Right.
kind of the what's it called, the fallacy of composition here, where you assume that because you can do something in one case that it can be done in general, and that's not really true.
Well, I think a literary component to this as well, an example of where this has been discussed outside of the realm of rationality, Marcel Proust said, "You can't reduce human suffering, you can only transfer it." And I think this is another way of looking at it, that there's this big pie in the sky idea that, and I think it's among people who are kind of techno idealists, that artificial intelligence can make the pie bigger for everyone. And I think that is either incredibly naive or deliberately false.
Yeah, that is incredibly naive. Yeah. It's funny. I'm surprised we're agreeing a lot more than I expected.
Well,
um,
I'm told you I'm taking this course because I'm kind of steel manning um, effective altruism against myself to see where I agree and what the good parts are and what the bad parts are.
okay. All right. So we sort of agree there that at least this is an important issue to consider.
Hmm.
It's naive to assume you can just help on a grand scale just because you can help on a small scale.
Hmm.
Another problem is the calculation problem. How do we calculate the effects of an action? Now, I'm sure this is probably discussed by the EA crowd quite a bit, right? That it's difficult to calculate the effect of your actions.
Yeah, they call it cluelessness and the limits of evidence, to where when you take action, you're usually only measuring the immediate actions, and it's far more likely that the impact of your action will be unmeasurable, and you will not be able to determine the consequence of your actions ultimately. And so we're clueless about why we should act, or if we should act, or what will be the effect of our action. So it's a core problem.
Yeah, although I would say that we can be somewhat clued in the sense that we can induce conservation laws or, system level principles.
So you're arguing in support of effective altruism then.
Well, no, I'm arguing that. Well, what I'm arguing though is that, uh, like the principle that it's zero sum at the margins, that life is zero sum, and therefore we can't be altruistic, is kind of like a system level principle.
Hmm.
So you can say, well, I can't work out all the effects of my actions, so how would I know what the effect is? But then you could also reason, well, every time one bubble goes down, another bubble pops up, or every helping one creature is harming another. There's a finite amount of energy, and so you can reason, at least energetically, that it's zero sum. Even though you don't know the effects of your specific action, you can reason that at a system level,
Right.
the effects of action are zero sum on the net energy flow and the net amount of life and so on. So there is some level of cluedness, but it doesn't support effective altruism because it says we can't really affect that. Uh,
Well, another I don't want to call it literary, but another perspective on this is
Literary is fine.
Ted Kaczynski, who says we can't know the future. One of his core principles of history is that you can't design the future on paper. And I think this supports, or at least it's probably he used this argument, this systems argument, to formulate this principle where you can look back and take examples from almost everything, but there's no way of knowing kind of where things are going to go. Even from a systems perspective, you can't know where things are going to turn out. There's too many moving parts at this point.
Well, I think you can make some general predictions using these high level principles. Evolutionary stability, for example. If something is not evolutionarily stable, you can predict it won't exist for, very long. You can't predict exactly what will replace it or exactly how history will play
Right.
out, but you can make some general predictions. And I think we could, if we could create enough collective rationality, we could, in some sense, choose our destiny, at least to a greater extent than we currently are. I mean, right now we're not. History is something that happens to humanity.
Mhm.
Nobody designed the Industrial Revolution, for
Right.
example. But I mean, I don't know. There's a bit of irony to Kaczynski saying that because I think he was trying to act into history,
Right.
right? So,
Well, he was actually so what he argues is that a revolution does two things. One, it destroys the current society, and two, it attempts to build a new society. And he said, since you can't do number two, the best you can hope for is number one. So he was actually valid and consistent within his own argument in this particular thing, but not saying he was consistent with everything. But he was just saying burn it all down.
yeah, well, but you can't predict anyway, I don't know. Kaczynski is another can of worms. All right, so I don't want to go off on too many tangents.
Oh, you're
Yeah,
talking
is
to the
that
wrong bitch then,
I
because
know, I
that's what
know.
I do.
Well, was that wasn't in his first thing though, right? That must be from his second
No,
writing,
it was
or
in the manifesto.
oh,
It's his
really? Okay.
principles of history, yeah,
Oh,
and
I'll
the
have to go
revolution.
back. I'll
Yeah,
have to
I
go
did a
back and look that up.
4-hour, video like, it was actually 2-hour audio recording on it, yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, let's shelve that for now. But so let's see, we did that life is competitive, the calculation problem. Well, another one is measurement. This, how do you measure benefit or harm even to a single individual? This is more linked to hedonism, I guess, a challenge to hedonism, but
Mhm,
that's also on the list here.
mhm.
So, but I'll
This
set that aside.
Okay.
Well, go ahead if you wanted to
Well, I
say
was gonna
something.
say this is something that, remains as an unchecked box for me in terms of exploring it with effective altruism, because I have not seen any attempt to address this. And I think they don't address it because it is such a subjective idea. to quantify quality of life or pleasure or suffering. So
Right, right.
I have not seen this addressed, at least yet, within the
Yeah,
community.
there's a question of if you wanted to act to change variable x, you need some measurement of x.
Hmm.
And how would you measure x? Which is
And a
it's a
lot of it's
combination of,
arbitrary. Yeah.
well, yeah, it's usually based on assumptions like life is good, so lives saved equals good or something like that.
Right. So this is that is part of their cluelessness discussion, though, is that you're operating on a huge number of assumptions when you act. So they do address that aspect. So maybe it would fall under that category.
Okay. We've already talked about altruism. I had that as one, that altruism is not evolutionarily stable, but we've already talked about that. So then I had a couple of thought experiments that I'm sure you're familiar with that are basically against utilitarianism.
Mhm.
There is the Omelus thought
Mhm.
experiment, and then,
Mhm.
of course, there is the infamous utility monster thought experiment. Are you familiar with those
Oh, no, I'm
concepts?
thinking of a different one. No. Actually, I don't think I know either one of those. Well, maybe if you explain it, I'll think about it differently.
Sure, they're challenges to utilitarianism. The Omelus thought experiment it's from a science fiction story, I think by Ursula K. Le Guin.
Okay.
Hopefully,
Yep.
I got that right. Anyway, I maybe I'm wrong, but I think that was the writer.
Probably. She was kind of brilliant.
In this story, there was somebody who was in like a dungeon, and there was this very happy society, but it depended on this one person being tortured. And so the question is, it's kind of like a trolley experiment, right? Like,
Mhm.
is the happiness of all these people justified? Does it justify torturing this one person, unfairly for no reason?
Mhm.
And another common counter argument or well thought experiment that's used to make utilitarianism seem absurd is the utility monster. You can imagine a being called the utility monster who has really, really intense feelings of pain and pleasure. Like when you eat a cracker, you feel a little bit, good, but he feels like, 10,000 orgasms. Or when he gets poked with a pin, it's as if you broke your leg or both legs or something like that.
Hmm.
So then, of course, we should then all, base our lives around making the utility monster's life as good as possible to, because this maximizes net utility, right? So it's kind of like a squeaky wheel getting the grease thing. Like
Mhm.
if we adopt this principle, then we are sort of at the mercy of the the person with the loudest emotions or something like that.
Mhm. So it forces kind of a Kantian moral on everyone.
Well, if you believe in utilitarianism, then you'd have to say yes. I mean, we should sacrifice 10,000 people. We should break 1,000 people's legs so that the utility monster can have a cracker, right? Which seems counterintuitive. Now, what these are really doing is just saying, well, you think utilitarianism is just intuitive, duh, it's obvious. Well, here are some counterintuitive implications of it. So either you have to abandon your appeal to intuition or accept the counterintuitive implications.
Mhm. Well, I think the problem is that people do not want to abandon, and this is the problem with utilitarianism in general. When we abandon our intuition and kind of the unknown, the woo-woo aspect of what makes us human, are we really even human anymore? So this kind of gets into the post-humanism thought process of like what actually makes us human. And I think a lot of right. I think a lot of people would argue that that's part of what makes us human.
Oh, just our sort of moral intuitions and that we just
Yeah.
act on. Yeah, I guess, yeah. Um, Although, well, I mean, people have different moral intuitions, though, so it's hard to say that's like a human. I wouldn't say that's like a human universal thing, but
And it may be changing. It may be completely shifting.
well, I think there's a tendency for people in the like people like Richard Dawkins, to assume that their moral intuitions are a universal, a human universal, and not the consequence of being in a certain environment.
Well, and then what's the effect of those people's intuition with a loudspeaker on the rest of humanity? because it's kind of true. If his moral imperative is projected loud enough onto the masses, it kind of becomes adopted.
Yeah, no, things can shift. Like you can see that with the shift in the moral views towards sexuality that have occurred largely because of the media kind of
Hmm.
edging people down a slippery slope in a
No
certain
pun
direction.
intended.
Well, it's a true thing. Like, yeah, the slippery slope is a real thing. Like, because moral intuitions aren't really grounded in any, they're not anchored by any like underlying principles or reasons. They really are just conformity based for the most part.
Hmm.
Like, people learn moral intuitions to conform to the moral intuitions of those around them.
Hmm.
And that means that if you change people's perception of what people around them believe by showing them examples of people believing something on TV, they will subconsciously shift in that direction.
Right. That's one place where the slippery slope is not a fallacy.
Well, yeah, it's never I mean, it's just a metaphor. The idea that it's a fallacy is actually itself a fallacy. It's like a left wing. No, I mean, it's just a bogus left wing argument against it because it's a right. It's often used by the right, so the left will then claim it's a fallacy, but it's not
Well,
a
it can be a
fallacy.
fallacy. It can be a fallacy in certain contexts, but it's very discrete contexts, I think.
Well, I think in the way it's normally used, it's not a fallacy, but a metaphor. And honestly, I think it is it condemns the right when they use it in a way, because what they're saying is we don't have any underlying principle anchoring this thing.
Hmm.
It's just, so we know that you can change it if you just try. If you just push on it, it will shift
Hmm.
and it will go down the slippery slope. So they're saying, yes, our beliefs are actually a slippery slope, which isn't, um, complementary to themselves. It's kind of a self own.
They're really good at that. They're really good at doing that.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the reactionary or conservative right or of the progressive left or
Right.
whatever.
Likewise.
Okay. So anyway, those are the thought experiments, and I think those what those do is just bring out the counterintuitive nature of utilitarianism. And then you could also get into a kind of meta argument, which is a deconstruction of altruism as bad faith, as signaling, basically.
What about from I mean, when you said that, I was immediately thinking like a Hobbesian kind of a perspective that it assumes that kind of a leviathan, that there's an unseen leviathan, that we have to go down this route of taking action and calculating risk, or else people will do the wrong thing.
Sorry, how does that relate? Is that
Well, the Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes' argument that society needs a leviathan, a monster, which can be in the form of government, an imperative, whatever it is, to guide it to do the right thing.
that this is a kind of like myth that is a post hoc rationalization for the social order?
Right.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that to some extent. Yeah. I mean, elites, like the richest men in the world, will claim that they're motivated by trying to save the world. Or Google will say, our motto is do no evil, or something like that.
Right, implying that there is an inherent evil that needs saving from.
Yeah, and it's a camouflage for the real motives and the real actions.
Maybe that's a good place to talk about my biggest criticism of effective altruism, which is, who's to say that this entire philosophy is not camo for the standard NGO? What am I trying to say? Like the way that NGOs operate now. So if you notice, this is like a classic liberal thing to do in this world where we have a pet cause and we want to continue working on that cause, where our ego is kind of tied to it and we're interested in it. And so we need to fund it. And so we have to build up this kind of whole community around this idea and these things that we're interested in. And the way I see NGOs is effective altruism could just be another one. I've never seen a philosophy take on kind of a persona like this, where it's raising money. The philosophy is raising money to support itself and to feed itself.
Well, it has to be evolutionary. It has to succeed evolutionarily, right? It's got to fight. It's got to fight with the other ideologies for the limited resources of the world.
Well, and this is why I argue that their aesthetic, I talk about their aesthetic, that if they're truly going to be effective altruists, they'll have to change it. Because they're ineffective altruists is what I would think at this point.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The whole NGO web is quite interesting. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, generally speaking, but yeah, there's this strange, like, other power structure. There's a combination of multinational corporations and NGOs that form a
Yes.
kind of alternative power structure. And you can certainly, yeah, deconstruct a lot of these noble causes as being camouflage and justification for that power structure,
Hmm.
which is really serving its own ends or the ends of elites. So yeah,
Exactly.
I agree with that.
Yeah, that's something I'm deeply interested in.
Okay, cool. All right, we're just agreeing too much.
Well, okay. We're not though. Okay, so the reason I was thinking about the aesthetic so much is because I was thinking, I forget what I was watching some sci-fi movie, and I remember thinking in the future. Oh no, I was watching the finale for the Obi-Wan last night, and it was god awful, by the way. But I was thinking about how Darth Vader is ruled by emotion and a negative emotion and anger, and the Sith kind of take that emotion and utilize it for what it's worth. But I was thinking, if an effective altruist philosophy were to take hold of the galaxy and kind of be the propelling and the driving force, it would have to assume some kind of emotionality to take advantage of the people and the constituents that subscribe to it. Like the aesthetic. The aesthetic would have to appeal to emotion because that's meeting humans where they are currently. Humans can't escape their own feelings and their own emotions about things right now. So I think what the problem with it is, and I'm probably giving the keys to the castle here, but the reason why it hasn't taken off is because they haven't met humans where they are.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important issue, which is how do you motivate people and how do you, like, to act effectively in the world on a large scale socially, you obviously have to motivate people.
But I will say, I think that one thing I do like about this community, I would say even like Future of Life Institute, which I submitted an application for one of their contests recently, and Future of Humanity. I've had discussions with people kind of higher up in those organizations, and I do think that they have a level of thoughtfulness about the outcome, that they're very scared and very, trepidatious about, if I do this one thing, there could be huge downstream implications. It could be a giant evil. And that's kind of their idea about moral progress, that they really do think that in the future we will look back on 2022 and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe we were doing that. Um, and so I think when I heard you talking about moral progress, you were arguing that it doesn't exist in nature, but I think however it exists, we have created it, because now we look back and we go, oh, we're so much better than we used to be, and we'll probably do that again.
Sure, well, it depends on where we are. We might look back and say, wow, I can't believe those guys had cars and airplanes and
Right.
food and all that stuff. Um, which I honestly think is the most likely outcome in 100 years. But like, I think what we'll look back on, it will look back on the follies of today as the Easter Island statues.
Hmm.
Like, Easter Island had that collapse, population collapse, right after they had their big, you know, mass insanity of building statues. And I think we're going to look back and say, why were we wasting time on all these stupid things when clearly we were on the verge of disaster?
Hmm.
But people, yeah,
Hmm.
anyway, but that's a separate issue. I mean, I think this is an important question. I think you need two tiers. I think any belief system that is going to steer us through history will have to have a way of meeting people where they are, like a kind of lower level ideology. But
Hmm.
ideally, it would have like a higher level rational um, theory and people at an intellectual level who, so it wouldn't just be smoke and mirrors. And it wouldn't just be something created by mimetic evolution, but something that was consciously designed.
You know who would agree with you?
Mohammed?
Ted Kaczynski.
Oh, Ted
Ted Kaczynski,
Kaczynski.
he said the
Well,
same thing. He said we have to have a two-tiered strategy, and one is to meet people where they are. We don't lie, but we meet people where they are. It's kind of a lower level philosophy. And then we have the kind of higher ordered, more rationalist philosophy that really understand the ins and outs of exactly what we're trying to do.
wow, I didn't realize Ted Kaczynski was so in line with my views. I
It's
honestly,
awful.
well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't bombed anyone, so uh, no. I
I'm
mean,
sorry.
I did listen to his manifesto a long time ago, but I really only remember the part about over socialization and stuff like that.
Oh, that's what most people, that's where they stop. And that's in the very beginning of the manifesto. And yeah, it's an interesting one because most people don't make it past that because they're like, this guy's a jackass. And he
Well,
is.
I agreed with that part. Actually, I'll give you later if you're interested. I have there's a good podcast on his views, but which you might enjoy since you're a Kaczynski aficionado.
I guess I am now. I didn't
Yeah.
never mean to be. I never meant to
No,
be.
no. I mean, I'm like known as a Lanza person now somehow.
Oh, okay.
Because I have you listened to the Lanza videos?
No, now I'm going
Oh,
to though.
okay. Yeah, yeah, that's he is a very interesting person. But okay, anyway, let's move on to hedonism.
Mm,
So I have some challenges to hedonism. And the first is that like altruism, it is an unexamined, unquestioned assumption, and thus not rational. It could frame rational thought, but it is not itself rational. And so there is no there doesn't seem to be an attempt by most people to question this assumption or even like think about it. Like what makes
right.
pleasure good and why would pleasure and pain be the ultimate source of value when these are
Hmm.
really just the states of a small number of neurons or a biochemical state in a small part of the brain, and you're saying this is what it's all about. It's all about this little part of the brain. That does seem a little absurd just on the face of it. Um, and this is something I
Okay.
questioned when I was very young, actually.
Well, going back to evolution and kind of your thought about what is evolutionarily stable, hedonism is a part of that because without the hedonistic tendency to pursue pleasure, we would not continue our species.
Well, I would argue that, well, there are two counter arguments to that. I would argue, first of all, that to say that we pursue pleasure is a homunculus fallacy, that we actually don't pursue pleasure, we feel pleasure. And it's sort of a bad metaphor to think of us as pursuing pleasure, but we're motivated to do things in the real world. Like
Hmm.
when you eat, you're motivated to eat, right? And then when you eat, you feel good. So you could metaphorically think of that as pursuing pleasure. But what you were really doing is eating. You were pursuing food. And the quality of pleasure is associated with the reduction in the motivation to eat, right? With the satisfaction of that motivation.
Hmm.
So I think this notion of pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain is a homunculus fallacy and a very bad way to think about motivation and human action.
Interesting. I've never heard of
Yeah, well, I've thought about these things a lot, so probably some of this will be kind of new. But so one point I would make about hedonism is that it inverts the functional relationship between emotion and action, because emotion drives action, right? Biologically, the purpose of emotion is to drive action
that. Hmm.
toward real outcomes, right? Like the emotion of lust drives you to have sex, which then has the effect of a child, right?
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
emotion of hunger drives you to eat, which has the effect of getting energy and matter into your body that you need to grow and, reproduce. So emotions are there biologically to make us act. It's not that we act to change our emotions biologically. We have emotions so that we act. Now,
Hmm.
to the hedonist sort of believes that the purpose of action is to change emotions, right? So the purpose of an action is to experience the pleasure that comes from satisfying a motivation. And this
Hmm.
is a very backwards way to think about purpose. It's like
Hmm.
if the robot thought that the purpose of everything it did was to change its motivation mechanism, you know. Uh,
So it's self-referential.
yeah, it's circular. It's like we act we're motivated to act, but then the only point of acting is to get rid of the motivation.
Right, but wouldn't you just call that a closed system, even though there are some effects? I mean, most effects actually escape the system, but I don't think that invalidates the pursuit of pleasure.
Well, I mean, first of all, again, I don't think you could say we pursue pleasure. I don't think that's a description that's valid. But what we're doing, is we're acting, right? We're motivated to act, and then we act. So I'm just pointing out that this is a kind of means ends inversion.
Perceptively, we are pursuing pleasure. Most people are
I don't think
not
so.
conscious that they are pursuing their needs, their biological needs. They believe and think, which I guess we could be getting into kind of a more metaphysical, uh, immaterial argument here, that perception is reality, right?
I don't think people believe that they're pursuing pleasure. I don't think that this is something that you arrive at when you're trying to develop an abstract theory of purpose or action or whatever. And the ordinary person is just like, oh man, I want to go out with that girl, or I want a car. They're not thinking, I want to have some pleasure. They're thinking, I want that. And then, which is, of course, biologically exactly the way they should view it.
I don't know. I mean, I think there are people, I mean, I think you're not giving people enough credit. Maybe I'm giving them too much, but I think there are people. I mean, like I have a friend who actively describes herself as a hedonist. Like she's like, I just want to feel good all the time. So she is actively pursuing pleasure.
Well, there are people who have this philosophical belief or this sort of abstract belief, but in the moment when let's say she's hungry and she has a sandwich, she's not thinking to herself, "Oh, I want to have some pleasure." She's just thinking, "I want to have a sandwich."
Well, she
Right?
makes choices in her
Because
life.
this
Like
is what
she's
we're
not
doing.
just,
We're pursuing real objects, real outcomes, real things in reality. We're not, as biological machines, we're not pursuing pleasure.
well, but she is in her choice. She's like, I'm not going to eat McDonald's. I want a artisanal sandwich. You know what I mean? Like she wants an artisanal sandwich. Like she's like, so what would you call that? If it's not just about sustenance, like, I mean, she's actively pursuing something outside of her own survival. Because what would be best for her survival would be something nutritious, well balanced. Did I lose you? Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you just broke off there for a minute. So just repeat what you said. You were
Oh,
just about to say
sorry.
she may was the last thing I heard.
So I don't remember where I stopped, but she is pursuing like something that is special. She is something that's outside of her need to survive. Because if she was actually pursuing her like sustenance, she would look for something nutritious and balanced. But instead, she wants to eat something that's actually probably quite detrimental to her survival because she's pursuing the dopamine, the serotonin, the pleasure.
Well, I don't think she's pursuing either of those things. I think she's just pursuing an ice cream cone or whatever it is. Like we don't have a homunculus in us that says, you should go get that pleasure, and we don't have a homunculus in us that says you should reproduce or you need to get these things to, survive. We just have emotions, motivations that are generated, right, subconsciously, automatically. And then those motivations lead to thought and action.
So the homunculus, the way that I learned about it was through physical sensation was kind of the way that we were taught what the term homunculus means. You're using it in a little bit different way, I think.
Well, let me explain. So, pursuit is a behavior of an agent, right?
Right?
And it's a behavior of an agent toward a goal, right? So, it's an agentive description of something. And it presupposes motivation. The agent must be motivated toward the thing. So, it presupposes motivation. So, you cannot explain motivation as the pursuit of pleasure, because then that's trying to explain motivation as motivation toward pleasure. So it's trying to explain the concept using itself. So it's infinite. It's an infinite regress, and that's what the homunculus is. It's like an infinite regress, which you explain like vision as the eye in your head seeing an image in your head kind of thing. Well, that doesn't explain anything. It's the same thing here. You can't explain it, motivation or emotion, using terms that presuppose motivation, right? Anyway, so that's That's why I would call that a homunculus fallacy. I think it's a very common one. I think the homunculus fallacy in general is very common because it's very hard to think about ourselves as mechanisms and as things that, like pleasure and pain, is just being states of a mechanism or
Okay. Okay,
changing
I see.
states of a mechanism, right? But
I
that's
see
the
where you're
right way
going
to
with this.
think about it because you can't explain consciousness with consciousness. You can't explain motivation with motivation. You have
Hmm.
to have a layer below that which does not have those things in it and then say motivation arises out of this mechanism. So this mechanism is what, motivation is. And so I would say pain and pleasure are like qualia associated with changes in motivational states. But it would be wrong to think of us as pursuing those qualia or avoiding those qualia. Okay, so that was another big tangent, but I mean, an interesting tangent. So, okay, but I do have some other ones I wanted to bring up. I mean, the measurement problem, which we already talked about a little bit,
Hmm.
because if you're situating value in these feelings, then you're situating them in subjective qualia, right? Just
Hmm.
feelings.
Hmm.
And there is no way to measure those feelings, even in yourself.
Hmm.
You feel them, right? Feelings are felt, but you don't have any record of them. You don't have any memory of them.
Hmm.
You can't bring the pain of a broken leg back to consciousness after the fact. You can remember, oh man, that sucked. I felt really bad. But you can't actually examine the qualia, even yourself.
Well, you can't accurately. You can't accurately.
Well, I mean, you simply can't, period. But you can examine other things like objective correlates of them, like screaming or yeah, I was rolling on the ground or whatever.
Well,
But
what about, let's take for, just the simplest example, which would be like phantom limb syndrome.
but what about it though?
Well, you're saying you can't examine a sensation or a feeling or emotion associated with the past, but people with phantom limb syndrome actually do and can, and it's a function of, physical nerves.
No, no, yeah, they're feeling something in the moment. I'm saying that
Mhm.
like you can't examine a feeling you had yesterday. You can't examine a
Well,
feeling you had.
by that you could potentially. I guess that would be by
Well,
proxy, but
phantom limb syndrome is not examined. It's not experiencing a feeling you had before. It's just that the nerves either are not firing or they are firing because they've been cut. I'm not sure which one. And so that creates a kind of sensation.
well, they are firing. It's about positioning. But I guess
Okay.
what that would be like a recreation of the feeling. It's not the exact same feeling. It's a recreation.
Sure, sure, but this doesn't really address the point that if you eat an ice cream cone and you feel good, there's no capturing that feeling, there's no measuring it, there's no
Right.
storing it. You can
Right.
store a memory of the experience as an idea, but never the experience itself. So we
Right.
are dealing with something that is intrinsically ineffable, unmeasurable, incommensurable, and so on.
Yeah, dare we use the word metaphysical?
Well, I mean, I would say phenomenological, but I mean, it's the point is that you can certainly look at correlates of it, and you can say, well, yeah, this guy's screaming, this guy's smiling, whatever. I'm not saying you can't like theorize about it, but you just have to keep in mind that
Mhm.
it is in some sense off limits to
Mhm.
science. Not off limits, but there is a step, a removal step. It's not the same as measuring an object.
Mhm.
Um, And then, of course, you have this problem of how do you sum up or compare qualia from one being to another or over a large mass of different beings.
Mhm. Right.
And then you have challenges to the idea that you could even increase net pain or pleasure in a single being. So I don't think you can. Like, I think these things balance out because of the nature
Agreed.
of the mechanism. Did you say agreed or?
Yeah, I did say agreed. Yeah.
Oh,
This is
really?
a concern I have with effective altruism because all of this is yeah, you're right. This is terrible because we agree. These are all arguments that I've raised and haven't heard any kind of real response to them yet. Granted, I'm not really talking with anybody kind of in the upper echelons of this, but I would love to see them address this kind of issue.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's another thing I'm surprised we agree on. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we can really change it because of the nature of the mechanism. Some people believe that life essentially is net negative, that suffering is almost all suffering, or pain vastly outweighs pleasure, or that
Mm-hmm.
pain has a greater importance than pleasure. So
Mm-hmm.
there are several challenges to this idea. By the way, are you familiar with Ethylism?
No.
Okay, I'll give you some links to that. That's a very radically, it's a utilitarian philosophical system that calls for the end of life, the total destruction of life. So based on hedonistic utilitarianism, essentially.
Right. Yeah, okay, so I'm familiar with this. I didn't know what it was called, but I am familiar with the argument.
Okay, okay.
It's like akin to antinatalism. It's a component of that. Yeah.
Well, it's related to antinatalism, but I think the antinatalists have a mishmash of different arguments that are not consistent. Like
Right.
some of them would say there's a consent issue, then there's Benatar's asymmetry, which is just a bizarre, I don't know, like it doesn't make any sense. Just he's kind of crazy. But then there is, I would say, the most compelling, at least, position is apholism, which argues that life is essentially bad. And so, it's like a life is a net harm in a sense. So I think
Hmm.
you might find that as an interesting counterpoint to
Yeah.
effective altruism.
I would love to read more about that because I do think I have considered this myself quite often that because of our perception and the negativity bias that we all employ, that it probably is a net negative. But I guess there's no, like you said, there's no way to quantify that, demonstrate it.
Yeah, well, I guess my now by contrast, slightly optimistic view is that it's net zero, that it really doesn't make any difference because, like, hedonic utility is essentially zero
Hmm.
sum because the
Hmm.
way the mechanism works is that when motivation increases, you feel pain. When motivation decreases, you feel pleasure. And
Hmm.
so these things balance out. And I think this makes sense in terms of how the brain works, although I'm not a neuroscientist. But generally speaking, most systems in the body are essentially like that. They have some resting state, there are
Right.
deviations from a resting state.
A large portion of the time, we're in quiescent states, which are net zero. They're neutral. Yeah. I guess it would depend on what you're talking about in terms of energy expenditure because there's still energy being expended. I haven't seen any calculations to demonstrate that, but it's hard to know because you have to have some basal level functions, but that would have to match up with the amount of energy you're taking in. So,
I think most of the time we're in essentially a low motivation state.
mhm,
Sometimes we go into a very high motivation state. And
mhm,
motivation, in essence, although it's more complex for humans especially, but in essence, it's about the activation of your muscles.
mhm,
So you think of your maximum muscular effort as being your maximum possible motivation, and your least expenditure of energy as being essentially your least motivation. And relating to this is the evidence of opiate addiction and so on, that you can feel pleasure at any moment by taking an opiate drug, which will lower your motivation to do things and thus cause pleasure. And then when the opiate drug wears off, your motivation
mhm,
returns and you feel pain.
mhm,
And you will not, well, at least most people would agree that this is not the key to happiness to just take opiate drugs all day, because no matter what, you're going to feel pain, even if you try to chemically induce bliss. So it seems like this is one of those things in which the mechanism is such that there is no way to get a net positive effect out of it.
yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think a lot more about it because I guess I have thought about this, but I've never really gone in depth into any of these kinds of discussions about, especially about like anything having to do with antinatalism, just because um, I'd say it's just intuitively. I mean, not being very effective in my altruism here. I don't really want to think that way, and I'm just going to call it subjectively like that. I just don't want to do it, so I haven't gone down that road.
Well, I'm more, I guess, committed to exploring the abyss or various abysses. But yeah, I'm not obviously not an antinatalist, but I've explored these ideas quite a bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's another issue with hedonism. The question of, well, is it even possible, like, to have more pleasure than pain? Then I can give you some thought experiments that, similar to the ones for altruism, that demonstrate that there are counterintuitive implications to hedonism or to maximizing hedonic utility. So, especially to hedonic utilitarianism. My favorite example is, well, if we really believe in this, that pleasure is good, pain is bad, and we should maximize the amount of pleasure in the universe, well, maybe the way to do that would be to have, get rid of all the life on the planet except for algae or something, and then have 10 trillion mouse brains in jars that are engineered
Mhm.
genetically or physically to just feel good all the time, right? If
Mhm.
it was possible to have this mechanism generate the qualia of pleasure, why not just isolate the mechanism? I mean, get rid of
Right.
the cerebral cortex, because who cares about that? Who cares about meaning? Who cares about doing anything in reality? Just get this little chunk of the brain, put it in a petri dish, and stimulate it in such a way that it's firing those whatever number of neurons, or it has that state that you claim to value.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem with a lot of your arguments, I'm kind of like coming to this conclusion now, is that I feel like you're straw manning effective altruism. You're referring a lot of times to hedonic utilitarianism, which I don't think effective altruism claims to be that. They have flavors of such, but they're strongly rooted in humanism. So that would go against any kind of arguments you drum up against a utilitarianism.
Well, this is an argument against hedonic utilitarianism specifically, not. I mean, I don't think effective altruism really ever gets into these questions of what is the purpose of life, or, I mean, it's probably several layers removed from that.
No, I think you're right that this is all the assumption that it's based on. Uh, but again, it's based on a humanistic utilitarianism, which I have separate questions and issues with that. What you're talking about has no grounding in humanity whatsoever. You're talking about it in terms of like a universal utilitarian.
Well, no, I mean, I've seen people who talk about effective altruism, like is it Robin Hanson or I think it's Robin
Mhm.
Hanson, talking about things like octopus farming and improving the welfare of sentient beings in general.
Mhm.
But this is
Mhm.
also a natural extension of this sort of human centered hedonic utilitarianism. Like you could say,
Mhm.
I don't care about octopuses, I only care about humans.
Mhm.
Well, if why?
Sentience is their, but this is their thing, right?
Well, yeah, I'm just saying you could if you're saying that effective altruism is solely concerned with humans, well then you could make the same argument. Just say, well, just take that part of the human brain that has the feelings that you're claiming are important, put it in a jar, make 10 trillion of these jars, or just put people in the matrix and plug them into VR and have them,
But
experience
what you're talking
orgasms
about
all
is
day.
post-humanistic philosophy versus humanistic philosophy. Humanism is before we deconstruct what a human is. It's kind of taking us where we're at currently, rather than deconstructing all the components that make us us. So it's a really hard position, I think, to defend for them. And I don't think that they are entirely humanist. I think it's sentience, but I mean, it's kind of a pseudo sentience. I don't claim to know exactly what their concept is, but I'm just raising arguments that I think the proprietors would would give
Well,
you.
yeah.
Like,
So, what would the argument be then? Would it be, well, we don't care about mice, we only care about humans, or would it be we don't care about brains in jars, we only care about brains in skulls, or like what would it be?
yeah, I think they would ask a lot more questions. And what I've noticed is they're quite hesitant to take a lot of stances on this. They raise a lot more questions than they do kind of give answers, which I can appreciate.
I mean, the other extension of that thought experiment is the simulation. Like, if you could
Right.
simulate it in a computer, then why not just have millions of computers simulating pleasure or something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, given that argument, I think there are quite a few people in kind of the elite that probably believe that we'll be better off. Like, look at what's happening with the metaverse. I do think there's this kind of Machiavellian tendency that is going to try and put people into a little sandbox.
Right, but the point is that this is a natural implication of hedonism.
Hmm.
because it would say it really doesn't matter what's actually happening. It just matters how you feel. So
Right.
if we could give you a drug that makes you feel good all the time, but makes you sterile, or makes you completely insane, or we just put you in a simulation or whatever, then you're better off because you're having more of these brain states, and that's all that matters. Like the point of the thought
Right.
experiments is to demonstrate that if you take this to its logical conclusion, you end up with something that most people would find horrifying.
Right.
So it's to raise the question about the assumption. It's
Hmm.
not like an argument against it per se.
Yeah. And I think that most people aren't ready to kind of address those downstream implications. But then again, having met some people who consider themselves EAs, as they like to call themselves, maybe they would. I think those people would probably plug themselves straight up into the matrix.
No, I think it's just a natural, yeah, if you're being rational about it and you have these assumptions, you would say, yes, this is the way to maximize hedonic
Hmm.
utility.
Hmm.
Who is that guy, Gregory something? Um, he's on Twitter quite a bit.
Ugh, I avoid Twitter.
Okay, well, I'm trying to remember. I think he's fairly big in that community. I know of effective altruism almost entirely from Twitter, and that means I don't know very much about it. But really, my critiques are more aimed at these assumptions and at humanism also, and some of these like moralistic fallacy arguments, or
Hmm.
the moralistic fallacy in biology. Like I think that's what the video you listened to is primarily about. That Sapolsky was projecting some kind of moral narrative onto the situation in which the baboons lost their alpha male or something.
Yeah, well, we know Sapolsky has his own moral narrative for sure. Um, I mean, you heard what his next book is about?
No, no, what's it about?
He's coming out with a book on free will and the argument against it.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. That's a whole other. There's a lot of debates. A lot of. It's funny because whenever you get into these things, I mean, what's interesting about them is that so many issues come up, right? All these important philosophical issues are.
Well, it's complexity theory. That's what we're really interested in.
Well, I think it's that when you try to be rational about anything, really, you start opening up all these unexamined assumptions, and you bring into the foreground all these assumptions. You realize that you're not standing on some kind of firm foundation that you always thought you were standing on. That actually, wow, I've just been taking all these things for granted.
Yeah.
But
Uh-huh.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I mean, I have my own views on free will and determinism, but I don't know if I would read Sapolsky's book on it.
I would probably read it just because I kind of grew up on Sapolsky. Like my
Oh, really?
advisor was a big fan of Sapolsky, and I think some of the work he does, like the work he's done on testosterone. My PhD was in estrogen, so the work he's done on testosterone as a motivational hormone rather than kind of a sex hormone or an aggressive hormone, I can
Mm-hmm.
appreciate kind of the paradigm shift that he has uncovered.
That's cool. Yeah, I'm sure he's done some good stuff. I seem to recall some things in his research that I found interesting or correct
Yeah.
once upon a time, but I don't remember very well. Um, but I find in general that biology and evolutionary psychology even has this, there's this tendency to see things through this moral filter,
Oh yeah.
like to
Yep.
impose this moral narrative on nature.
Hmm.
Um, I'm very critical of academic biology for that reason, even though obviously a lot of it is, correct.
Yeah, a lot of it is incorrect as well. A lot of it is junk, and a lot of it is will never be repeated and is a complete waste of money. But
Well, that's the sad thing about academic research, that a lot of it is just garbage. Yeah.
right,
I mean, you know that, and it's it's like a sad truth because I did a master's and I left after that because I just believed that there wasn't any way to do interesting research in the academy.
really, we should have a separate conversation about that because I'm starting a new podcast on the life outside of academia in terms of kind of what independent scholars do
Oh,
and
okay.
what I would consider kind of the crumbling infrastructure of academia.
Yeah, sure, that'd be cool. Well, I guess we
Yeah,
should wrap this up. It's been a
yeah,
bit over an
we should.
hour. This has been a really good discussion, even though we didn't disagree as much as I had hoped.
Well, I still have hope for effective altruism. I still have hope that it'll turn into something maybe useful.
No, I actually enjoyed agreeing with somebody for a change. It's actually refreshing. I'm just kidding, but I really enjoyed talking to you. So yeah, hopefully we can talk again.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having this discussion with me.
Thank you. I'm glad we finally were able to set it up.